Before we begin, imagine this for a moment. Imagine that the story of Jesus you were taught was only the outer shell of something far deeper. Imagine that beneath doctrines, rituals, and centuries of institutional interpretation, there exists a hidden path. A path not based on belief, obedience, or external authority, but on direct experience, inner awakening, and a radical transformation of consciousness. Think carefully. What if Jesus did not come primarily to establish a religion, but to demonstrate a state of being? What if his true message was not about worshipping him, but about becoming like him? And what if the final revelation of his journey, the most powerful and unsettling truth of all, was deliberately obscured over time? Stay with me until the very end of this series, because the last part will bring all of this together in a way that may permanently change how you understand Jesus, yourself, and the nature of divine consciousness. If this kind of exploration resonates with you, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who questions the surface of reality, and leave a comment. Your interaction helps this message reach other seekers who feel that something essential has been missing from the spiritual conversation. What we are about to uncover is not commonly discussed, and for many, it reshapes how life, faith, and the universe itself are understood. For centuries, most people have encountered Jesus through simplified narratives, stories designed to be accessible, moral, and orderly. Yet for countless seekers today, these portrayals feel incomplete. They sense that the depth of his message has been flattened, that the mystery has been replaced by repetition, and that something profoundly transformative has been lost along the way. This dissatisfaction is not a rejection of spirituality. It is often a sign of spiritual maturity, an inner intuition that truth cannot be fully contained within rigid formulas. This is where the concept of Gnosis emerges. Gnosis is not belief, it is not doctrine, it is not membership in a religious system. Gnosis refers to direct knowing, an inner illumination that arises from experience rather than instruction. In the ancient world, this kind of knowledge was considered sacred because it transformed the knower. It was not information about the divine, it was participation in the divine. When we approach Jesus through this lens, a radically different picture appears. Not a distant figure demanding faith, but an awakened being demonstrating what is possible when consciousness aligns with its divine source. This perspective does not seek to dismantle faith, but to expand it. It invites us to see Jesus not as an exception to human potential, but as its fullest expression. Early scholars like Elaine Pagels and Hans Jonas have shown that Gnostic traditions were not fringe fantasies, but deeply rooted currents within early Christianity. These traditions emphasized inner awakening, self-knowledge, and liberation from spiritual ignorance. In this context, Jesus becomes a guide pointing inward, repeatedly emphasizing that the kingdom of God is not something to wait for, but something to realize within. Ask yourself honestly, why would Jesus so often speak in paradox, metaphor, and hidden meanings if his message were meant to be purely literal? Why would he say that those with ears to hear would understand if understanding were automatic? These are not the words of someone offering simple moral instruction. They are the words of an initiator, someone speaking to different levels of awareness at once. This is not about rejecting tradition. It is about recognizing that spiritual truth operates on multiple layers. The outer story comforts, the inner meaning transforms, and for those willing to look deeper, Jesus' life begins to resemble not a theological argument, but a living map of spiritual ascent. As we move forward, we will explore the ancient roots of this path, the esoteric currents that shaped his teachings, and how his experiences point toward a universal process of awakening. But for now, sit with this question and consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. If Jesus was showing a way rather than demanding belief, what might that mean for your own spiritual journey? Now let us move deeper, beyond the surface of familiar stories, into the forgotten landscape that shaped Jesus long before his public ministry began. To understand his ascent to divine consciousness, we must step into the spiritual atmosphere of his time, a world alive with mystery schools, initiatory paths, and ancient streams of wisdom flowing beneath official religion. Jesus did not emerge in a vacuum. He was born into a crossroads of cultures, philosophies, and sacred traditions. The Mediterranean world of his era was saturated with esoteric knowledge drawn from Egyptian mystery schools, Platonic philosophy, Jewish mysticism, and Near Eastern initiation rites. Scholars such as Philo of Alexandria reveal that concepts like logos, divine reason, and inner illumination were already circulating among spiritually inclined seekers. When Jesus speaks of light, truth, and awakening, he is not inventing a new language. He is activating an ancient one. Consider his repeated emphasis on inner transformation rather than external conformity. Again and again, he points attention inward. He speaks of purity of heart, of eyes that see, of rebirth not of flesh but of spirit. These are not moral platitudes. They are instructions encoded in symbolic language, recognizable to anyone familiar with esoteric initiation. In this framework, spiritual growth is not granted from above by authority, but realized from within through awareness. One of the most radical statements attributed to Jesus is that the kingdom of God is within you. Read plainly, this sentence destabilizes centuries of religious hierarchy. It implies that access to the divine is immediate, internal, and available now. From a Gnostic perspective, this is the core revelation. Divinity is not distant, it is latent. Awakening is not obedience. It is remembrance. Ask yourself why this idea feels simultaneously liberating and unsettling. If the sacred resides within consciousness itself, then no institution can monopolize truth. Responsibility shifts inward. The seeker becomes an active participant rather than a passive recipient. This alone explains why such teachings would later be softened, reinterpreted, or buried beneath layers of doctrine. Even the miracles attributed to Jesus take on new meaning through this lens. Instead of supernatural interruptions of natural law, they appear as expressions of awakened consciousness, acting in harmony with deeper principles of reality. Healing becomes alignment. Authority over nature becomes coherence with it. In Gnostic thought, matter itself responds to consciousness, when consciousness is no longer fragmented by fear and ignorance. This reframing does not diminish the power of these acts, it intensifies it. It suggests that what appears extraordinary is actually natural at a higher level of awareness. Jesus is not displaying exclusive power, but demonstrating what becomes possible when the inner divine spark is fully realized. Now consider his time in the wilderness. 40 days and nights alone, fasting, facing temptation, and confronting inner shadows. Across ancient traditions, periods of isolation and deprivation are classic stages of initiation. This is where the false self dissolves and deeper perception emerges. The wilderness is not punishment, it is preparation. It is the symbolic death of the old identity and the awakening of a new state of being. When Jesus returns, his words carry a different weight. His presence shifts. Authority flows from experience rather than position. He speaks as one who knows, not one who speculates. This distinction matters. Gnosis is not something you learn secondhand, it is something you become. Notice how often Jesus uses parables. These are not simple stories meant only to teach ethics. They are layered symbols designed to bypass the rational mind and awaken intuitive understanding. To those seeking rules, they remain stories. To those seeking truth, they become keys. This method was common in mystery traditions, where knowledge was revealed progressively as consciousness matured. Think about the Transfiguration, where Jesus is described as radiating light. His form altered, his identity revealed beyond the physical. Read literally, it is miraculous. Read symbolically, it is the unveiling of the divine self within human form. A moment where inner realization becomes visible, a glimpse of what awakened consciousness looks like when fully embodied. Scholars such as Carl Jung later recognized these patterns as archetypal stages of individuation, the integration of the conscious and unconscious into a unified self. From this perspective, Jesus' journey mirrors a universal psychological and spiritual process, one that transcends time, culture, and theology. As we approach the next part, an even more provocative question emerges. What if traces of this Gnostic message were never fully erased? What if they are still hidden in plain sight within the canonical texts themselves, waiting for a different way of seeing? Reflect on this and share your thoughts. Have you ever sensed that familiar passages carried meanings beyond what you were taught? When you approve this part, we will move forward into the texts themselves, uncovering what was preserved, what was obscured, and why it still matters now. Now we arrive at the threshold of the most revealing dimension of this journey, the place where everything we have explored converges. What many do not realize is that the Gnostic current was never fully erased. It was muted, reframed, and domesticated, but its echoes remain embedded within the canonical texts themselves, visible only to those willing to read with a different level of awareness. When Jesus speaks in the first person using the phrase "I am," something profound is happening. These are not casual expressions, nor merely statements of personal identity. In mystical traditions, the declaration "I am" points to universal being itself, the same awareness that speaks through all existence. When Jesus says, "I am the light of the world," or "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he is not making an egoic claim of superiority. He is articulating a state of realized consciousness, one that transcends individuality and aligns with the source of all life. Early mystics understood this language intuitively. Modern scholars like Rudolf Bultmann and Elaine Pagels have argued that these statements reflect a mystical worldview in which divine reality is accessed through inner transformation, not external validation. In this light, Jesus is not separating himself from humanity, but revealing what humanity is capable of becoming when ignorance dissolves and inner knowledge awakens. This reframing changes the meaning of salvation entirely. Instead of being rescued from the outside through belief alone, salvation becomes a process of awakening from within. It is liberation from spiritual blindness. It is the movement from fragmentation to wholeness, from unconscious living to conscious participation in the divine order. Faith, in this sense, is not passive acceptance, but trust in the process of inner transformation. Notice how often Jesus challenges blind adherence to rules while emphasizing inner alignment. He confronts hypocrisy, mechanical religiosity, and the substitution of ritual for realization. His harshest words are not reserved for sinners, but for those who claim spiritual authority while remaining inwardly unawakened. This is not rebellion for its own sake. It is a call to authenticity, to lived truth rather than inherited belief. From a Gnostic perspective, the crucifixion itself takes on symbolic meaning beyond historical tragedy. It represents the collision between awakened consciousness and systems threatened by inner freedom. Yet even here, the message does not end in suffering. Resurrection is not merely a reversal of death, but a symbol of transcendence. Consciousness liberated from identification with the material self. Life recognized as continuous, not confined to form. Carl Jung once observed that Christ can be understood as a symbol of the self, the integrated totality of the psyche in harmony with the divine. This does not diminish Jesus. It universalizes his message. It suggests that what he embodied was meant to be mirrored within each individual willing to undertake the same inward journey. And this brings us to the most powerful revelation of all. If Jesus' path was a Gnostic ascent, then it was never meant to be admired from a distance. It was meant to be walked. The true legacy of Jesus is not an institution, a creed, or a hierarchy. It is an invitation. An invitation to cultivate inner stillness, self-knowledge, compassion, and direct experience of the sacred. In a world overwhelmed by noise, distraction, and external authority, this message feels more urgent than ever. Ask yourself this honestly. What would change in your life if you stopped searching for truth outside yourself and began listening inwardly? What fears arise at the idea of personal revelation, and what freedoms might lie on the other side of them? In our time, the call of Gnosis is re-emerging, not as a rejection of spirituality, but as its deepening. It asks us to move beyond borrowed beliefs and step into lived understanding, beyond dogma and into direct knowing, beyond worship alone and into embodiment. If this exploration resonated with you, share your reflections in the comments. Your insights may spark recognition in someone else who feels this same quiet pull toward deeper truth. And remember, the ascent Jesus demonstrated was not exclusive, it was exemplary. The path is inward, the light is already present. The question is whether you are willing to see.